Marsden appeared at the door. "Macey, what a pleasure," he said. "I've been looking forward all day to your report." Welcome to Behind the Bottom Line. I'm James Schofield, the writer, voice artist, producer, editor, marketing manager, and everything else for Behind the Bottom Line, the podcast which allows me to share my quirky stories about business that were originally written for different magazines and publishers. This is season 9, and we are in episode 6 of a thriller set in the diamond industry called 7 Continents. So where have we got to? Macey Church has spent her day inside the headquarters of 7 Continents, looking to see if she can find out who could be behind the plots to smear the company and its CEO, Sir Gilbert Villiers. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world in Kazbakistan, her friend and colleague, Kirill Solokov, is setting off across the desert to meet the Kerkomen nomads to see if they maybe have some answers to the activities of 7 Continents in Kazbakistan some 10 years earlier. He is travelling with Dr Irina Kerkomenova, an anthropologist and sister to Sir Gilbert's wife Tatiana, to whom Kirill was once engaged. Confused? Then stay listening and all will be revealed. Maybe. Chapter 11. Meeting Marsden. After finishing her interview with Nancy Inovix, Macey found herself dragging her feet as she made her way through the narrow streets around Covent Garden to the office of Eco-Warriors to report to Roy Marsden. Firstly, it seemed that every shop window was packed with things that she needed to look at. Where else could you find a shop selling Betty Boop tote bags next to an esoteric bookshop with scented candles, crystal balls, and tools for feng shui? But more importantly, Macey did not wish to be alone with Marsden. She leafed through some of the esoteric books to pass the time and see if any of them had recommendations for how to deal with him. They did, but the advice seemed to mostly involve Macey being allowed to reorganize his office furniture to allow the correct flow of chi into his heart, and she felt that might be a little difficult to arrange at a first meeting. So she bought herself a little amulet to protect her from bad spirits instead. Finally, she found herself in front of the Eco-Warriors building at 7 Dials in Monmouth Street. She took a deep breath and went inside. It was radically different from the 7 Continents office she had visited that morning. The walls were covered with posters on every wall, urging the voyeur to boycott, save, recycle and reject or support an astonishing range of causes, from agribusiness to zero emissions. The staff were young, t-shirted, bearded and very friendly. They sent her upstairs to the 6th floor where Marsden had his offices in the Gaia suite. It was plain to Macey that quite a substantial part of the money that was donated to Eco-Warriors, and she had read it was an exceptionally well-supported charity, had been spent on the top floor. There were rooms for workshops, luxuriously equipped with video conferencing equipment and beautiful ergonomic furniture smelling of beeswax polish. Instead of posters, the walls were bare, except at the end of the corridor where there was a large electronic plasma display with sentences that glowed in electric blue neon for a moment, faded and were replaced. Next to it was a door with Marsden's name on it. Marsden's secretary, very smooth, polished and well dressed, sat behind a desk reading. A sign told Macey he was called Tarquin d'Urberville. "Yes," drawled Tarquin, eventually tearing his eyes away from a copy of Vogue Homme. "I'd like to see Dr. Marsden, please. My name's Macey Church." "You don't have an appointment," Tarquin accused her. "Dr. Marsden is a very busy man." "Tell him I'm here. He'll see me. I'll wait." She sat outside and studied the messages that appeared and then faded every 2 minutes on the screen. "One flight to New York generates 0.6 tons of carbon dioxide. 2/3 of the world have no access to clean water. In the time it takes you to read this, 3 children will have died in sub-Saharan Africa." Macey stopped reading, determined not to kill any more children in sub-Saharan Africa. Marsden appeared at the door. "Macey, what a pleasure," he said. "I've been looking forward all day to your report." Macey followed him into his office past Tarquin, who was now busily pretending to complete an Excel table on his computer. Marsden's office was even more expensively furnished than the other rooms on the 6th floor. Large windows looked in the direction of Covent Garden and could be opened to let people out onto the roof, where an entire ecosystem of plants in elegant pots had been positioned. The furniture was all pale wood and white leather, apart from the desk, which was made of glass. The effect was to make everything focus on Marsden sitting behind it in his signature black linen suit, fingers pressed together, elbows on the table, and an expectant look on his face. "Well?" "I spent a day interviewing Nancy Inovix, and she always struck me as being a possible candidate. She's been at the company a long time. She was close to Gilbert's predecessor." "Nothing. She says he's tough but fair. He's doing well for the company and he's created a good atmosphere. At the moment, I really couldn't say that there is any sign of her being the source of the threats." There was a moment's silence. Interesting. What did your colleague, what's his name? Kirill, yes, what did he think?" Without any hesitation, Macey lied and said that Kirill was down with food poisoning and that it wasn't looking good for his being able to help much that week. "How inconvenient," grumbled Marsden. "Still," he smiled, "it'll perhaps allow us to cooperate more closely on this project." Macey wondered if it was too late to send a plane to Kazbakistan to fetch Kirill. "Which reminds me," Marsden continued, "tomorrow I have another meeting at this time, so I suggest instead of meeting here, we go to the opera. I have a spare ticket for Verdi's Othello." "Oh." Macey thought hard. Her instincts told her this was not a good plan. On the other hand, the newspapers had said that the production and cast were unmissable. After all, there wasn't much Marsden could do in an opera house. "Well, thank you," "What time should we meet?" she said finally. 6:30 in front of the main entrance. Good luck with your interviews tomorrow. I'll look forward to some interesting news in the interval. Macey left the building, wondering if she had made a mistake. Chapter 12. The Kerkomen. By sunrise on Tuesday morning, Kirill and Irina were heading along the single-state highway, the Land Rover bouncing from side to side of the road, as Irina swerved between the potholes. The back was laden down with canisters of food, water, petrol, tools in case of a breakdown, and a large box filled with packets of sugar, salt and chocolate. This, as Irina explained, was meant for the nomads. Most other food they can get from their camels and goats, or they can hunt. But sugar and salt they have to buy or barter. So, if you want to make friends with them, that's what you take. The countryside as the road wound slowly up into the mountains was wild, but tree-lined at first. They passed only the occasional truck heading back down towards Doshk. "How did you get to know these people?" asked Kirill. "I travelled with them for about 6 months in another part of Kazbakistan close to the border with Russia when I was writing my doctoral thesis. They're incredibly tough. They can live on next to nothing and travel all day and all night if they have to. They say that they are descended from soldiers left behind by Alexander the Great, and it's true that sometimes they have these bright blue eyes and blonde hair. One interesting thing about the Kerkomen is that they are a matrilineal culture, so everything is inherited through the mothers. And their language, quite amazing. It reflects what is important for them. So they have over 50 words for different types of camel, in the same way other cultures have many different words in order, for example, to describe the word Greek. As they travelled on, and the landscape became emptier of life, Irina taught Kirill what she knew about the Kerkomen. At about midday, they reached a small town on the edge of the desert. There was a small garrison of policemen with an overweight and irritable captain. Initially, he was inclined to be suspicious and unhelpful. But after he had examined Kirill's passport and taken the $50 bill that Kirill had thoughtfully placed there in advance, he was all smiles and hospitality. He confirmed what Irina had thought, that the Kerkomen were currently at the Tufa oasis. "They passed through here the day before yesterday. A bunch of thieves, if you ask me. Several chickens went missing from the town. Why does a pretty girl like you want to visit a load of crooks, Irina opened her eyes wide and smiled innocently back. "Oh, I don't, Captain. That's why we'll be leaving here as soon as we have bought some gas." He was still scratching his head, trying to work out what she meant as they left the town behind. It was dusk when the oasis finally came in sight. At first, just a dark smudge against the brown and grey of the mountains behind it. Then the shape of trees could be made out, and finally, as it became dark, the orange of their fires guided them to the tents, or yurts, as Irina called them. As the car bumped slowly away from the road, small children and dogs came out to meet them. When they got out, they were instantly surrounded by a noisy group, calling out Irina's name and holding out their hands, while the dogs jumped and barked in excitement. Dazagertu! Dazagertu! A fierce voice split the crowd, and an old woman hobbled through, her wrinkled face surrounded by the bright, colourful scarves that the Kerkomen women traditionally wore. She stood for a moment in front of Irina, looking at her critically, a tiny figure leaning on a stick. Then her face split into a big smile, decorated with very few teeth, and the two women hugged each other. Kirill, this is Roxana. Roxana, this is Kirill, Irina said. Kirill wasn't sure quite what to do, so he stepped forward, took her hand and kissed it. Roxana looked at him in astonishment, then burst into laughter, poked Irina with her finger, and said something that Kirill thought was probably rude, but not unkind. Other adults appeared from the yurts and crowded around Irina, curious to see what and who she had brought with her. Irina laughed and shouted answers to all their questions, until finally the old woman grew tired of the noise and chased most of the crowd away with her stick, then ushered Irina and Kirill into her yurt. Kirill was amazed. It was lit by brass oil lamps, and the floor was covered in beautiful rugs like the one on Irina's walls, decorated in fantastic patterns. The scene could have come from the 1001 Nights. But then Kirill saw to one side, in strange contrast, a small television set, its screen flickering with images from MTV. Two little girls were standing in front of it, dancing in imitation of the bizarre figures on the screen. Roxana chased them out with her stick and turned it off. They sat on the floor with a small group of older men and women, though none of them were as old as Roxana. Food appeared. Chicken. Kirill thought he knew where they had come from. Small spicy rice balls, goat's cheese and kefir. As they ate, the conversation flowed back and forth. Kirill smiled, nodded, and understood little of what was said. The language was very ancient, Irina had told him, but with no written form until modern times. Instead, they had an extensive oral tradition with stories of gods and spirits, feuds and battles, love and death, handed down from generation to generation. Kirill gradually became aware that Irina had moved the conversation around to the diamond mine. Find out if they know how long the mine was in operation, Kirill asked. The answer was long, involved, and provoked intense debate amongst the elders seated around them. About 7 years, Irina replied finally. They say it finally closed down about 10 years ago. At first there was much talk of the place becoming the centre for a huge diamond mining operation. But the number of diamonds they found became smaller and smaller, until at the end they were just losing money. Apparently 7 continents just took any equipment they could use out of the site, padlocked the gates, blew up the main road, and left. The buildings are all still there, up in the hills behind the oasis. Do you think we could get inside? Would they take us there in the morning? Can you ask them? Asked Kirill excitedly. Irina explained what they wanted, but this time there was a long silence. Finally, the old woman broke it. Her story was long, and Irina listened intently, whispering quick translations to Kirill as Roxana paused or consulted the other elders. As you know, Irina, our life is a hard one. To survive in the desert, many things are important. The strength of our animals, the paths we choose, the desert storms and the rainfall. So when we're here, it is not only a time to rest, we must also perform our religious ceremonies to protect us for the coming year. In this area there is a connection to the afterworld, and we believe that here in the hills the spirits can pass from one world to the other, so we pray and sacrifice to them to win their protection. The mine was placed exactly in the place where this magic, this connection to the other world, is strongest. In the years when the mine was there, we were afraid that the strangers would disturb and anger the spirits. At first nothing happened, so we lost our fear. But then, about 12 years ago, there was a terrible change. We came to the oasis as normal, but something was different. At first we didn't notice, but after a week our people and the goats and camels started to fall sick. Then some died. We tried to get help from the government, but those people are stupid and corrupt. They wouldn't listen to us when we told them that the water was poisoned. They said it was our fault, and we should stop our travelling and live in some filthy houses. So we left the oasis and didn't return again until the strangers had given up searching for their pretty stones. And then we made peace with the spirits again. Tell her that we want to find out what the strangers did in the mine, Kirill said to Irina, that we'll try to find a way to get compensation for her people. What Irina said was longer and more involved, and Kirill could tell it involved a lot of pleading. After she had finished, there was silence for a while, until finally Roxana turned to Kirill and spoke to him directly, not in her language, not even in Russian, but in a strange, though understandable English. We helps you, Mr. Kirill, not because we believes you gets money for us, but because Irina's sister's man and child's is in trouble. But be careful with Irina. If she is hurt, you pays. So there we are for this week. Everything clear now? Probably not, but I hope you found today's episode entertaining. If you did, tell your friends about it, and please rate the story on Apple or Spotify, or better still, write a review on my website www.behindthebottomline.com. And at this point, a big shout out to Monica in the US. She wrote a lovely review recently where she gave BBL a 5-star review and said, I quote, "Great stuff. I love listening to this podcast. It's a real feast for the senses. Surely more than one was involved." I wonder what she was doing. My appetite has been whetted for more. Well, Monica, thank you very much. It makes a big difference to know that people enjoy what I do. Next week in episode 7, Macey carries on her investigations in London and makes some interesting discoveries, all of which she can tell to Marsden when he takes her to the opera. Meanwhile, no champagne and canapes for Kirill and Irina. They are about to go underground and run into Kirill's worst nightmare. If you'd like to buy the book or the ebook version of 7 Continents, you can do so by visiting my bookshop on my website www.behindthebottomline.com. There you can also find Peril in Venice, a thriller full of drugs, murder and adventure, set, of course, in Venice. And also a romantic comedy, Double Trouble. Nicholas and Timothy Aldridge, identical twins with very different lifestyles, change places and cause huge amounts of trouble before finding fortune and true love. So, until next week, take care and goodbye.